Race riot? Watch this space. This is breakthrough news on Israeli settler brutality.
Is 24/7, 365 violence against every Palestinian man, woman, and child everywhere, all the time. They're never free from the violence. What we've seen since the beginning of the year, is Israel has escalated its raids into Palestinian cities and refugee camps. It's killed almost 70 Palestinians since the start of the year, and many of them in these massive daytime raids that have happened in cities like Jenin and Nablus. For example, in Nablus on February 22nd, a massive Israeli army force went into the very densely populated old city of Nablus in broad daylight, guns blazing, firing indiscriminately, and killing a dozen Palestinians and injuring 100 more. This has been happening all over the place. And so, quite predictably and inevitably, there has been an upsurge in Palestinian resistance. This year, so far, 13 Israelis have been killed in the context of violence. 7 of them were killed in a single shooting attack that came again in response to one of these massive Israeli raids on a Palestinian community in which multiple people were killed. So it's a cliche to talk about a spiral of violence or a cycle of violence, because that erases the responsibility. But we can talk about a spiral of escalation. I don't know if that metaphor even works, but there is sort of a violence escalator. At the root of it is the violence of the Israeli occupation and settler colonial invasion of Palestinian land. That's what's driving it. And what we saw
Ali,
in those, sorry.
No, please, I didn't want to interrupt you. Go ahead. I thought you were. Well, I wanted to ask you. This is fun. You go ahead and then I'll go ahead. Let's do that.
Well, I just wanted to say that that's sort of the broad context for what we saw in that brief clip, which is the settler pogrom in the village of Huwwara, where 2 settlers were killed a week ago on Sunday. 2 settlers were killed in Huwwara village, and then the Israeli army allowed hordes of settlers to pour into the town, ransacking businesses, setting fire to homes, killing 1 Palestinian, and taking their revenge. And all of this, it's important to note, because these images were so shocking to people around the world that Israeli leaders started to say, oh, we'll have to put a stop to this sort of thing. This isn't what we intended. It is what they intended, because prior to this pogrom and during the pogrom, top Israeli leaders were inciting it, praising it, saying that we want to see Huwwara burned, we want to see the village destroyed. Bezalel Smotrich, the Israeli finance minister, on the same Sunday when the 2 settlers were killed, said Israel should go mad on the Palestinians and start attacking Palestinian cities with tanks and helicopters. So the settlers were simply doing the bidding of the Israeli state.
And I'm glad that you raised that, because the response from...
By definition, this is fascism. I always feel very uncomfortable when people around me are pro government forces. That's the definition of fascism.
the US and the EU has been very much to try to condemn both sides, but in interestingly different ways. I actually want to show a clip of Ned Price being asked about this, if we could bring that up, and I'd like to get your reaction to it. Just waiting for the clip. Sorry, guys.
Yes.
I
There we
noticed
go.
in your tweet yesterday you referred to the shooting in which 2 Israelis were killed as a terrorism, whereas the settler violence was separated. Was that deliberate? And if yes, how do you differentiate or decide when to use the word terrorism versus when not to?
I think it's best not to parse and to go into definitions from the podium. We are condemning the extremist violence that we've seen over the past couple days. We issued a very strong condemnation of the killing of the Israelis that we've seen over the weekend. We've issued today a very strong condemnation of the violence that's resulted in the death of a Palestinian and the destruction of property. In all of these cases, in all cases of extremist violence, we think it's important that there be accountability, that there be justice, equal justice under the law.
So, Ali, I mean, that's, to me, what I see there is Israeli settlers committing acts of violence, committing a pogrom is just violence. And it's bad, but it's violence. Whereas Palestinians who live in the West Bank attacking settlers is terrorism. What do you have to say to that?
Yes, that's consistent. Israelis can't do terrorism. Only Palestinians can, according to both the United States and the European Union, because the European Union, being the lapdogs of the United States, copy exactly what the Americans say and do. And so the EU position has been identical. But listen to what Ned Price said. He said, equal justice under the law. What law is he talking about? First of all, we're in occupied territory where Israel is the military occupier. And under the Israeli military occupation, there is no equal justice under the law. Palestinians live under Israeli military rule and military orders, whereas the Israeli settlers live under Israeli civil law. So right there on paper, you have a separate and unequal system. You have an apartheid system. If you're an Israeli settler, you're not subject to military law. You're subject to the Israeli civil system. If you're a Palestinian, you're subject to Israeli military law. But if you're a Palestinian, you don't get as far as the law. If you pick up a stone, you'll just be shot dead. Whereas the settlers are treated with kid gloves. In fact, they're protected by the army while they are busy attacking Palestinians. And that's not just in Huwwara, that's all the time. In fact, for example, you could go to the website of B'Tselem, an Israeli human rights group, or their YouTube channel. They have tons of videos going back years documenting Israeli settlers attacking Palestinians, attacking and killing Palestinian livestock, burning their property, destroying their trees, while the soldiers are watching and just, protecting the settlers while they do this job of vandalizing Palestinian property and making Palestinian life hell on behalf of the Israeli state. The settlers are the fist of the Israeli state, of Israeli land theft and settler colonization. And that is absent from the language of the State Department. And when he talks about equal justice under the law, who's going to bring this equal justice? The military occupier? I mean, we're coming up, I can't believe how fast we're coming up. It will be on May the 11th, the first anniversary of the cold-blooded murder on live television of Shireen Abu Akleh, a US citizen and the correspondent of Al Jazeera. Has there been justice for Shireen Abu Akleh? On the contrary, the United States government helped Israel cover up her deliberate murder. And this has been the policy of the Biden administration, of the Democratic Party, that the more extreme, the more violent, the more fanatical Israel shows itself to be, the more the Democrats do to cover it up, the more that Joe Biden does and Antony Blinken do to cover it up and to try to blame Palestinians for it and tell Palestinians, you guys, you need to calm down. You need to calm down and restore calm. While they're shipping every weapon in the American stockpile to Ukraine so Ukrainians can fight back against Russia, they're telling Palestinians, you just need to calm down and take it. And if you lift so much as a rock in the face of your invaders and your occupiers, then you're a terrorist and they have the right to shoot you dead. This is the reality. It's a reality that I don't think any people in the world would accept. But Palestinians are told, just calm down and accept it. And if you're good, if you behave well, maybe we'll give you a couple of million more dollars for health clinics in refugee camps where you're going to live forever, by the way, because we're never going to support justice for you so that you can go back to your homes.
No, it's no lies detected. I mean, I for sure. I mean, it's unbelievable, almost like the fairy tale nature of some of this, the way it's, I remember during the Great March of Return, you know, people are peacefully marching, getting sniped down, and then when Israel's being criticized, it's like, well, there's terror kites being flown, and it's just so absurd that you would think, like, this is so laughable, but it's allowed to you know, play out in the media, and certainly if you want to comment on that, I'm happy to hear, but one thing I want to also ask your thoughts on, Ali, is it seems that the resistance in Palestine, especially amongst young people, is also strengthening majorly. I mean, I'm seeing all these videos of these night marches of people coming out, the calls from Lion's Den from people to resist. Now I see the PA trying to catch up at the last second and say they're going to do something too. So I wonder how you also evaluate, you know, what seems to me to be almost a generational changing of the guard here of Palestinians really coming out in a powerful way.
I think, you know, let's step back and look at the big picture, because the particulars of what's been happening now can only be understood against the bigger picture. Since Israel was established by force and illegitimately over the ruins of hundreds of Palestinian towns and villages, Israel has tried to subdue the indigenous Palestinian population with every violent method. Regular massacres, which we've seen throughout the West Bank, in Gaza, even of Palestinians within so-called Israel, punitive home demolitions, revenge demolitions, a tactic which is reserved for Palestinians. Israel will never demolish the family home of a Jew who murders a Palestinian. That punishment is reserved only for the families of Palestinians, collective punishment. A very savage method, always used by colonial regimes, is if we make the natives suffer enough, eventually they will accept their subordinate position and stop resisting. So murder, imprisonment, torture, home demolitions, aerial bombing, anything, Israel has done it. And 75 years after the Nakba, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, the Palestinian people are not subdued. And remember, the Israeli justification for these murderous raids in Jenin, in Nablus, in Hebron, wherever it is, oh, this is to thwart terrorist attacks. Well, the very next day, Palestinian resistance groups can carry out sophisticated operations against Israel. And an even more common phenomenon is these individual actions by Palestinians, Palestinians picking up a knife or picking up a gun and going to get, going to retaliate, or you could say get revenge. Israel cannot stop it. In fact, everything Israel does fuels it. And so what we see is a frustration in the settler state that, look, we've done everything to these people and they're still fighting back. So it's a constant escalation of Israeli terror, of Israeli collective punishment, with the aim of subjugating this people who refuse to be subjugated. So when you look at this young generation, they're undeterred. They are undeterred. But they also have no choice because, you know, people are already living in refugee camps like Aqbat Jabir or Arub or the camps across the West Bank, which Israel is raiding, Sha'afat camp. The Palestinians, okay, we're already in refugee camps. What do you want from us? No, they're still sending in the army and attacking people in refugee camps and killing them and carrying out extrajudicial executions. So it's not as if people have a choice but to fight back and defend themselves. That's what Palestinians are doing. They have a right to fight back. They have a right to defend themselves. And who are all these people in the West to quibble with them? People who are okay with Israel using anti-tank missiles in the middle of the old city of Nablus. People who are okay with Israel using high-powered sniper rifles against children at the Great March of Return. And they're quibbling with the Palestinians throwing stones? Are you kidding me? Then send the Palestinians precision-guided missiles so that they can take out the Israeli military bases and the military command posts where these attacks against them are being planned. But Palestinians are left alone against a merciless nuclear-armed enemy, and then they're being lectured from the West, oh, you mustn't do this, you mustn't do that. Palestinians won't take those lectures from people, and they will fight back with the means they have. And the escalation is coming only from the occupier and the invader. This conflict would be over tomorrow if Israel were to respect the rights of Palestinians, were to respect international law, and were to respect the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people. But the reality is this: if Palestinians stop resisting, they will be wiped out. If Israel stops attacking them, there will be peace.
And from the Struggle News Network, or Struggle Video Network, this is more on the Huwwara Pogrom as a race riot.
Explain the meaning of an old Russian word to you. It's pogrom. It means a violent mob attack on a minority group. It's Russian, but it's also gotten into the Yiddish language of Jews, because Jews.
And it's not Hebrew.
The most likely victim of pogroms in old Russia. We used to have them regularly in the United States against blacks. Here they were called race riots. Whatever you want to call them, a mob of at least 400 Israelis attacked cars and homes in Huwwara, which is a town of 7,000 on the West Bank in Palestine, supposedly in revenge because 2 Israeli children were killed, supposedly by a Palestinian. Benzion Sanders from the Israeli Soldiers Group.
Yeah, I want to amend that. They weren't children, so that's incorrect.
Breaking the silence, wrote this on a tweet. Sunday night pogroms, West Bank, 70 plus houses burned, 100 plus cars burned, tens injured, 1 killed, 6 arrests. I point out that the Israelis arrested were detained for attacking Israeli soldiers, not for any of the arsons, and a court let them all go. By the way, 1 Palestinian was killed. His name was Sami al-Aktash. These are his children at his grave. The next day, an American was killed in the West Bank. His name was Ilan Ganeles. He was from West Hartford, Connecticut. There was major coverage in the U.S. media, and very shortly, 3 Palestinians were arrested for his killing. What about the death of Sami al-Aktash? You think the Israeli police are even investigating? Don't kid yourself. As you see video of the burning, note the voices of people praying Jewish prayers. Either they had taken time off from the mob attack to pray, or they were some kind of cheerleading chaplains of the event. This man, who evidently follows the Kahana cult variant of the Jewish religion, says, there is something very exciting here. Jews are not silent. What the army is unable to do, what the police will never do, simple Jews come and do a natural act of revenge. They set fire to everything that comes next to them. The army says that it was unprepared for the size of the pogrom. Baloney. The Israeli group B'Tselem writes, this is exactly what Israeli control looks like. The settlers carry out the attack, the military secures it, the politicians back it. It's a synergy. All the cars in this lot were set on fire. Here is what the lot looks like now. The main street in the town is now shut down. No Palestinian is allowed to open up his shop. Journalist Gideon Levy on Democracy Now! Said that Israelis are free to drive into Huwwara to see what they still need to burn. This man was arrested for parking his car near his shop. Breaking the Silence wrote, after Goldstein massacred Palestinian worshippers in 1994, the IDF shut down Hebron for 2 months. The same thing is happening now in Huwwara. These policies are not anomalies. They're features of the occupation. This is the leader of the U.S. Senate, Chuck Schumer. On February 24th, in Israel, he said, as Senate Majority Leader, the highest-ranking Jewish American elected official in history, I stand here in the shadow of my ancestors who perished in the Holocaust to promise that as long as Hashem breathes air into my lungs, the United States Senate will stand behind Israel with our fullest support. Consider what that means. There is nothing that Israel could do that would stop Chuck Schumer from standing behind the Israeli government. On the 25th, he was shown in a photo with his arm around Benjamin Netanyahu. That was a day before Huwwara suffered the pogrom. Well, it's been 4 days now since the race riot. What has Schumer said about what happened in Huwwara? I've been looking at Twitter, his website, and Facebook. Not a word about Huwwara. Schumer indeed stands behind Israel, even as it displays naked supremacist apartheid. This is Bezalel Smotrich, Israel's finance minister. After the pogrom, he called for the town of Huwwara to be wiped out. He's slated to come to the United States on March 12th to address a dinner in Washington, D.C. selling Israel bonds. These bonds are money loaned to Israel to be used for any purpose. The Israeli paper Haaretz says that Israel takes in $1 billion a year via Israel bonds. Many U.S. states own Israel bonds. They use teacher and public employee pension money to buy the bonds. In Connecticut, the Treasury owns $1.5 million in bonds among its many, many investments in Israel, totaling, at last count, over $85 million. In other news, in a first vote, the Israeli Knesset has voted in favor of a law establishing a death sentence.
And Press TV on the matter.
Some 68 Palestinians have been killed at the hands of Israeli forces and settlers in the occupied West Bank.
The Israeli regime is stepping up its violent and racist policies against Palestinians. On Thursday, a young Palestinian man succumbed to his injuries that he recently sustained during an Israeli raid on the occupied West Bank city of Jericho, also known as Ariha. 22-year-old Mahmoud Jamal Hamdan was critically wounded during an Israeli attack on a refugee camp. On Wednesday, Israeli troops stormed the Aqaba Jab refugee camp following a shooting attack on a highway outside of Jericho that left one Israeli soldier dead. During the raid, the regime's forces sealed off the camp and prevented ambulances and journalists from entering it. They also fatally wounded Hamdan, whom they accused of being involved in the attack. Regime atrocities come against the backdrop of increasing settler violence against Palestinians. On Sunday night, hundreds of armed Israeli settlers, flanked by soldiers, attacked Palestinian villages near the West Bank town of Huwwara and set fire to homes, storefronts, and cars.
I was here yesterday when the incident occurred. I didn't know how to escape, as they closed immediately all roads and exits. So I was obliged to stay here. I locked the door, and after that the settlers came to burn things. They set fire to all the wood I had, the car, and they burned the area.
At least one Palestinian was killed and nearly 400 were wounded in the hours-long rampage, which was denounced by Israeli rights group Peace Now and B'Tselem as a settler pogrom supported by the occupying regime. Palestinian officials have called on the UN Security Council to ensure protection for Palestinians, who have increasingly come under deadly attacks by Israeli forces and settlers.
What we have seen here in this house is evidence of how big the crime carried out by the settlers and covered by army and protected by the army is. It is clear that this move is supported by a political decision from the Israeli cabinet. Therefore, three sides are partners in this crime. The cabinet, which takes the political decision, the army, which is protecting the settlers, and the settlers who are implementing. This is what we have seen here.
We have the evidence. No one can dispute the evidence. We heard the evidence. We saw the evidence.
The Arab League has also said that it fully holds the far-right Israeli administration led by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu responsible for the systematic crimes committed by extremist settlers.
Israel has also approved a bill authorizing the execution of Palestinian detainees who conduct anti-regime operations. Palestinian resistance fighters have vowed to continue their campaign against the Israeli regime in retaliation for its crimes. Attacks against Palestinians have escalated since December 2022 when Benjamin Netanyahu returned to power as the head of the Israeli regime's most far-right cabinet ever.
After they went on a violent rampage in the West Bank, Israeli forces have killed nearly 70 Palestinians since the beginning of this year. On Tuesday, the Israeli Knesset approved a bill authorizing the execution of Palestinian detainees who conduct anti-occupation operations. Hamas resistance movement has strongly condemned the bill, noting that the move reflects the regime's, quote, fascist tendencies. Hamas has stressed that such policies and laws will not deter the Palestinian people from continuing their legitimate resistance against the Israeli occupation. Furthermore, on Wednesday, Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, who is an ultra-nationalist in Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's extremist coalition, said that the Palestinian village of Huwwara should be wiped out.
All over Israel, here in Tel Aviv and elsewhere, we are protesting against the horrific pogrom committed by the extremist settlers in the West Bank yesterday. They came because they have the support of the government. They have the support of high-ranking Kahanist ministers serving in the government, and they are deepening the occupation, deepening the bloodshed.
So we are here tonight to demonstrate after the settlers in Huwwara attacked and burned the village and the people who live in Huwwara, the Palestinian people. And we are here to demonstrate to stop the occupation.
Even the U.S. administration, which is Tel Aviv's staunch ally, has called the remarks repugnant. Attacks against Palestinians have escalated since late December 2022, when Benjamin Netanyahu returned to power as prime minister of the occupying regime's most far-right cabinet ever. Netanyahu is now under mounting pressure. Streets across the occupied territories have witnessed mass protests since Netanyahu's controversial move to reform the judiciary. Opponents argue that the legal changes threaten the independence of judges and weaken oversight of the ruling cabinet and parliament. They say the plan will undermine the rights of minorities and would open the door to more corruption. But Netanyahu, who is on trial for corruption, says the changes will boost business. There are now threats that his coalition cabinet will break up due to internal differences and mass protests.
Ukrainian forces are
Watch this space. Your engagement through a like, a share, and a subscribe will propel us at warp speed towards the continuation of our mission to truthfully go where no news will have been going before. And just in continuation of our story here, Huwwara mayor, Israeli settlers inflicted damages worth 18 million. The Israeli settler gangs who rampaged through the occupied West Bank town of Huwwara inflicted damages worth 18 million, according to municipal source. The town mayor, Muin Damidi, said that the damages wreaked by the hundreds of settlers who attacked the town south of Nablus on Sunday, burning down at least 35 houses and partially damaging 40 others and torching or destroying more than 100 cars, was worth 18 million Israeli lira, I think it is, which is, let's see, ILS. It's about $5 million U.S. money. Let's see what Israeli new shekel. New. At least one Palestinian was killed and nearly 400 wounded in hours-long rampage on the town, as well as in other attacks on West Bank towns and villages south of Nablus. This is not to mention the other losses sustained by the town residents, estimated in hundreds of thousands of shekels, as a result of the ongoing closure of the businesses and stores, the media added. He pointed that schools were still closed for 3 days in a row, and the gun-toting soldiers prevent the residents from using the main street. He made this statement as Israeli forces continue to cordon off the town for a third day in a row, exclusively turning it into a closed military zone and forcing its residents to close their businesses. That was from Wafa, and also from Wafa, most Israeli settlers arrested over a terrorist rampage in Huwwara were released. Israeli occupation authorities released last night most of the terrorist Israeli settlers, and you can call them Zionist occupiers, most of the terrorist Zionist occupiers who'd been arrested against the backdrop of a pogrom they carried out on Sunday night in the Palestinian town of Huwwara, south of Nablus. Media sources said the settlers were released based on a court ruling which claimed there was not enough evidence to convict the occupiers, despite the availability of tens of videos documenting the terrorist attack on the village. It resulted in the killing of Palestinian aid worker, the injury of many others, and the torching of hundreds of homes and vehicles. Besides the killing of a humanitarian worker, the settlers completely burnt down at least 35 homes and 40 others were partially damaged, and many of the buildings were set on fire while the Palestinian inhabitants sheltered inside, and more than 100 cars were burnt or otherwise destroyed. Israeli media outlets had reported on Tuesday that only 8 settlers were arrested following the pogrom, and that many of them had been released. The Israeli court's ruling also comes amid racist remarks by Israeli Minister Bezalel Smotrich, who said the Palestinian village of Huwwara should be wiped out. I think the village of Huwwara needs to be wiped out. I think the state of Israel should do it. Smotrich, who also handles civil administration in the occupied West Bank, was quoted saying by Israeli media on Wednesday. Smotrich's remarks have been met with condemnations from the U.S., the EU, and many other countries. And we'll be back with more news.